Hi there, and welcome to this Hall of Tyrannus podcast, which has been brought to you by the Tree of Life Foundation. My name is Johan Snyman, and I'm your podcast host. Today we have the privilege of speaking to Peter Doyle. Peter started his career with an international student internship program in London, where after he started with Metropolitan in Cape Town in 1980, where he fulfilled various roles up until 2008. Amongst other, Executive Director of Employee Benefits and Health Business, Managing Director of Metropolitan Life, Director of Metropolitan Subsidiaries, and Group Chief Executive Officer of Metropolitan Holdings, a position which he held for 10 years. Throughout this time, he was also involved in various other ventures, including as a council member and later president of the Actuarial Society of South Africa. He has also contributed greatly towards HIV/AIDS research throughout his career, from leading a team in developing an actuarial model and presenting papers on the subject, to ultimately contributing to a better understanding of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Africa and its impact on the continent. So Peter, you've seen and researched and modeled a few pandemics in your lifetime. So I'm very interested to hear from you what, according to you, would be the most apt analogy for the current pandemic we find ourselves in globally.
Well, thank you, Johan. I think it's interesting to think about that because for many of us, perhaps for all of us, we've never experienced anything like this in our lifetime before. And, we've seen epidemics at a distance like Ebola and SARS. We heard about them, we read about them. We've had the HIV and AIDS epidemic, I think we can compare to that. But what we're seeing is something quite different. I mean, it's quite different in terms of its intensity. It's unbelievably intense. It's unbelievably quick. It's unbelievably global. And I think that's very different to things that we've seen before. And, maybe an analogy could be if we are dealing with a crisis and a disaster that's sort of unfolding. But if you think about something like a tsunami or an earthquake, it's very quick and immediate, and you have ramifications after that. You know how to deal with it and cope with it. That's like a sprint, 100-meter sprint, and then it's over. Something like the AIDS epidemic, I've been involved in or dealing with for probably 25, 30 years nearly. It's like a marathon. It's a long, old, unfolding thing, and we've had a lot more time to think about it and look at the data and that. With COVID-19, it's quite different. It's it's going to be with us probably for 1 or 2 or 3 years. So it's quite a long time to sustain a disaster, and it's like a middle distance race. It's like an 800-meter or a 1,500-meter race where you're almost sprinting continuously because every day you're dealing with new things, but it doesn't come to an end anytime soon. And that's quite difficult to sustain. I mean, even for people psychologically and emotionally and in other ways, it's quite a challenging thing, and we probably haven't seen this in our lifetime before.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's quite an apt analogy, and I think most of us started out thinking that it might be a sprint or hoping that it might be a sprint. But a middle distance race, I think if you speak to most athletes, it's one of the hardest races to run. It's not a marathon, but it's also not a sprint. So you need speed, but at the same time, you need endurance. So you mentioned the AIDS pandemic, and 100 years ago, also a once in a century type event, we had the Spanish flu or the Great Influenza, 1918 to 1920. And I'm interested to hear from you, having looked at both of these and having been intimately involved with the AIDS pandemic and modeling it from a health and medical perspective. How does COVID-19 compare to those two pandemics?
Well, I think it's worth looking back at 1918 because, in certainly not my lifetime, but in our collective lifetimes, it's probably the thing that's most similar to COVID-19. I studied it quite a bit. There's various books that's been written on the Great Influenza. And, there's many similarities. Of course, it is a flu-like disease, although COVID-19 is, the medical properties are quite different. But the mode of transmission is similar, i.e. it's contact and it's droplets, and all the health and hygiene issues that were found in 1918 are the same now. And, it's really interesting. I mean, you'd think 1918 is ancient history, but if you read through the history of 1918 and the books that have been written on it, there were many similarities. The one similarity was that it was a global epidemic. It spread right around the world. Even in those days when there wasn't flying, but there were certainly ships that went around the world. As you know, it came at the end of the First World War, and so therefore there were troops being moved right across the world back home from Europe and so on. And of course, they spread the virus quite significantly, which is one of the reasons it was called the Spanish flu, because some of the early cases came from Spain, but that wasn't really the source of the epidemic. Things like quarantines, stay-at-home orders, wearing of masks, all of those things happened in 1918. It's actually quite eerily similar. Orders of magnitude were very large. They reckon that up to a third of the global population at that time were infected by that flu. And the numbers of people that died in 1 year was estimated to be about 50 million people. So it had a great impact on the world. And it's not unsurprising that we sort of look back to that for some kind of insight and guidance. So you can learn from history, and you can even look at a city level. There were certain cities that took what we would today call lockdown actions, and they had a better outcome than the cities that didn't. So there is some merit in looking at those sort of things. If you look at HIV and AIDS, it's of course quite different. It's a very different epidemic. Essentially, it's a sexually transmitted disease. It's a very slow-acting disease. As you know, from the time you might be infected by HIV until you show symptoms might be 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 years or 15 years even. And so there's a very long period of asymptomatic state. Whereas for COVID-19, the expectation is that within between 2 to 10 days of being infected, you'll show symptoms if you're going to get sick. So it's quite different. But there are things that you can learn from all of these. And one thing that we've seen is just how political it becomes, because it is such a massive issue and because it affects everybody. It's very political. It becomes very political. It's tough on the leadership on how to deal with it. And we saw that with HIV and AIDS, and we're seeing it now with COVID-19.
It's amazing when referring to the Great Influenza, the measures that they took are so similar. It feels quite unique, wearing masks and being in lockdown, and hearing that those kind of measures were implemented 100 years ago brings it home and makes it feel like much closer to home for that matter. I think you mentioned in a conversation we've had before that Cape Town was one of the hardest hit cities during the Great Influenza 100 years ago. And I'm just wondering out loud, what were some of the driving forces behind the reasons for Cape Town being so hard hit at the time?
And that's a good question. I think with all epidemics, but particularly these airborne and influenza type epidemics, the big factor is mobility or movement. And it stands to reason. I mean, the virus can't just spread by itself. It spreads, by the agency of people moving. So mobility and movement are really one of the critical factors. And I suppose the other one is density, housing density, or the way people live. I think those are two of the really big factors that help facilitate the spread of the virus. Okay. If you think about Cape Town, even 100 years ago, it was an important city. It was a gateway into Southern Africa. It was a port. It still is a port, but in those days, many more people came through the port as a mode of transport. There were many ships that came back from the Second World War. In fact, earlier on, troops going towards the First World War, and so there was a lot of movement of people in and out of Cape Town. So that would have been a reason. A second reason, though, was there'd been earlier in about 1917, there'd been a big flu epidemic that went around the world, and it didn't really get to Cape Town. I'm not too sure why. But there's a lot of research in the United States of America where this particular flu went through the states. It didn't affect every state well. And the states where it hadn't been seen in 1917 had a worse outcome in 1918 because people's immune systems weren't prepared for this new flu. So that's one of the issues that one needs to look at. I mean, you can lock down and quarantine and keep people away from the virus, but if eventually it will affect you, and one of these things is about herd immunity, is how the community builds up immunity. That's something that we're still far away from understanding with COVID-19. The numbers of people infected so far are still actually quite small, probably less than 10% of the community is being infected, so there's no herd immunity. And this is a completely new virus, and I think that's the one thing that really makes this so dramatic, particularly now, perhaps not so much in 1918, but now we're sort of used to medical science having the answer for everything, having a cure for everything. And all of a sudden this virus comes along and we don't know anything about it. We don't know how it operates, we don't know where it came from, we don't know how many people it's going to infect. And I think it's almost got a fear factor to it, it's something new that we can't deal with. And I think there's a lesson in that. And I think the lesson is one of being a bit more humble about who we are, and a bit more humble that we don't know everything and certainly can't control everything. And so in 1918, there's a matter of interest. They went through the whole global pandemic of flu, but they didn't yet know that there was a flu virus.
Sure.
So they'd never even isolated or knew what it was. They just could see the symptoms. And so that was, for us at least, we've isolated the virus. We can see it and deal with it, but we still can't cure it.
Sure. It's really true. I think there is a big fear factor globally because of the fact that there's so many unknowns, the fact that we don't have all the answers and everything is developing at a rapid pace, the information and the outlook and medicine not having all the answers in science. I think it is quite unnerving for a lot of people. But as you mentioned, a great realization again of the fact that we're not as in control as we might think we are as humanity, and there are a lot of uncontrollable variables out there that we are exposed to on a daily basis. Another very interesting thing that we've discussed in a separate conversation, which I think might be quite relevant for this discussion, seeing that most of our listeners would be under the age of 40, being part of all of Tyrannus network, is that you mentioned that during the Great Influenza 100 years ago, it was the economically active and younger population who was at a higher risk of mortality, of dying during the Great Influenza. Whereas today we know that it's more focused towards the older population and those with comorbidities who are at a larger risk or greater risk. So I'd be very interested just for you to talk to us again about why that was the case.
Yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about the two epidemics and the two diseases. We talk about the Great Influenza because it was exactly that. It was a flu virus. It was just a new flu virus to humanity. But the remarkable thing was that the people that actually died from it was disproportionately young adults. Which is unusual. I mean, normally flu affects the elderly more. And at that time, it was very difficult to understand. I mean, it was obviously some people thought it might have been because of malnutrition, but I mean, that affected everybody, after the First World War. But medical science eventually, once they started to understand the actual mechanism of that flu, what they identified was that the people that died from the virus were people whose immune systems were actually very active and very robust. And oftentimes it was the very aggressive response of the immune system to this new virus that actually filled people's lungs with fluid and caused these very bad pneumonias and ultimately death. And for older people, the immune systems weren't that good. So the response wasn't that good. I mean, that's quite an irony, really. And so they sort of understood that later with time, and then, of course, with how to treat it, and particularly how to treat pneumonia. With COVID-19, I think one of the things that we're learning is we should be careful to call this even a flu. It's not like the flu at all.
Okay. It's
not a flu virus, it's a coronavirus. And as you know, there's an increasing amount of research, and interesting enough, some of the most recent research that's come out on this topic has come out of Stellenbosch with some doctors. They're identifying, the few people have talked about this in South Africa, is that this is a blood disease and not a lung disease. Okay. So I think what happened is initially, and I think it's probably worth spending just a little bit of time on this, is that initially, particularly in Italy and Spain and the UK and things like that, we all were sort of brought to the understanding that there's a flu epidemic, it's a lung disease, you have oxygenation problems. And it's starting to turn out that that's not really the focus of where COVID-19 affects people. It really is a blood-borne disease, and it affects your vascular system and therefore your major organs. And so what they were finding was that they were ventilating people, i.e. providing them with super rich oxygen, but it wasn't helping them to breathe. And it turns out now the research is starting to show that that's not because there's a lack of oxygen. It's because the blood is not able to process the oxygen. It's not able to take it into the bloodstream and circulate it to the organs. And that's why these comorbidity issues are now coming to the fore as being much more important with this epidemic. So because the blood is such an important part of your ecosystem and part of your immune system, the fact that it's affecting your blood and the ability of the blood to act the way that it should in terms of taking your immune factors around the body, taking oxygen around the body. So that's a big new development in terms of understanding both the, let's call it the dynamics of the disease in the body, but most importantly, how to treat it. And, we can maybe just touch on that a little bit. In the media, of course, there's a lot of discussion or hype or expectation around a vaccine, and a lot of focus on the vaccine and vaccine development. And personally, I don't think a vaccine is really the most critical thing that's going to help us. I think the more critical thing is how to treat the disease. So I think you're going to see much more development in treatments. They're already understanding a lot better how to treat people with low oxygen levels. They're understanding better when to put people on ventilators and when not. As you know, there's a new drug that's just been reported on in the last 2 weeks called dexamethasone, which is a steroid, a low-cost steroid, which has had a fairly, a material effect on the ability to keep people alive and reduce the mortality from the epidemic, from sickness and death. And I think a lot more is going to happen in terms of understanding just how this virus works in the body, and a lot more understanding will come around how to treat it quite long before we get a vaccine. And I think it's important to understand that, because people just sort of assume, and we mentioned this earlier, around being in control of it. I have a bit of a worry that people thinking, well, by the end of this year, we'll have a vaccine, we'll all have an injection, and then it's all going to be fine. I think there's a low probability of that. I think it's going to take longer than we think. Vaccines are not easy in this space, in this particular kind of virus. Then you get the logistics of distribution and manufacture around the world and things like that. So it might take quite a lot longer than people expect for a vaccine. But throughout and during that time, the really key issue is how people are being treated.
Thanks, Peter. That is super insightful. I must say it's new news to me that it's blood-borne. I think I've missed that. So that's very interesting. And also interesting to hear that, we shouldn't pin all our hopes on a vaccine, and that we should rather focus on how to better treat this virus, which I think is new news for a lot of us. Maybe if I can pivot to the importance of data and information in times of a pandemic. You've been intimately involved in the modeling of the AIDS pandemic, as we've mentioned, since the 1990s. And you're again very heavily involved with the modeling of COVID-19 in conjunction with Actuarial Society of South Africa. So I'd be very interested to hear from you what role data modeling plays in times of a pandemic, and why it's so important to accurately model these types of events.
It's a big question, big topic. So obviously data is always important and only to understand. I think the big difference now, when we did the AIDS model, I'm talking about the late 1980s, early 1990s. Okay. Our major problem at that time, there was so very little data available. There was some data available in the United States, a little bit in Europe, but nothing in Africa or in emerging markets, where the AIDS epidemic was very different. And so for about the first year when I was involved, before I actually developed a model at Metropolitan, I literally spent just collecting data. And actually what I mean by collecting data was talking to people. And I literally went to lab level, to the blood transfusion clinics, to the Hillbrow AIDS Clinic, to Baragwanath Hospital, to King Edward Hospital, and just meeting people and just saying, do you have data? What data do you have? It had an immense benefit though, because it did mean that when I got the data, I actually really understood it. I mean, I didn't just see a number. I'd actually spoken to the person that had collected the data. I spoke to the people in the lab that processed the data. At that time, there were 2 or 3 different tests for HIV. And it depended on which test was used and which testing protocol was used. So I actually learned a lot about how the data was actually produced before I saw the numbers. And so that helped a lot, because later on, and that's what we're seeing now, later on there was a sudden almost deluge of data. And so it's quite difficult sometimes to make sense of all this data, but having done all the initial research, when I saw data, I could immediately say, well, that's credible, or that's a good source, or I understand the bias in this data. And obviously, almost all data is biased. Mm. And I think it's important to understand data bias. It's not a deliberate bias. It's not like somebody's produced the data and said, I'm going to deliberately distort it. It's just biased because of where it comes from, how it was collected, what treatment or what testing protocol was used, what sampling population is being used, sample size, etc. So, to really use data properly, you need to do a lot of thinking about what is this data, where does it come from, what's the probable bias, and so where does it fit into my analysis. And I think once you get that mindset, I developed a sort of a methodology. I thought, well, I didn't use any data that I only saw in the media. I only used data that I got to where I could see the scientific basis of it. I only used data that had been published or verified, or where I'd actually personally spoken to the people collecting the data. And so that helped quite a lot. You have this automating sifting that goes on in your mind as you see data, and you can sift it more easily and quickly, and categorize it and then use it. So I think that's a very important issue, because today there's so much data. I mean, if I move forward to today on COVID-19, there's an unbelievable amount of data available, yes, even though it's new. But really, you can find an immense amount of data. So the challenge is even more pronounced today, that you need some sort of mechanism, even in your mindset, to say, how do I process this data? So what's useful, what's not useful, what are my sources? And then once you have the data, how do you actually use it? Now, where the modeling comes in, initially I did the modeling because we wanted to know how to price our products in a life insurance company environment. Later on, once we published that, people started asking questions about treatment and about social impacts, like on orphans and dependency ratios, and on population growth numbers. And so what actually happened is we initially published it from a purely actuarial point of view, and then later on we started doing a lot more modeling work just to answer all the questions we got. And I suppose that's really the essence of modeling, is you do a model to answer a question.
Nice.
And sometimes, it's not, is the model right or wrong? It just is the model useful to understanding something. So I think it's also helpful to say, well, in COVID-19 now, are you doing a model to understand hospital bed capacity and healthcare planning? Are you doing a model to understand sickness and mortality trends? Are you doing a model to understand the economic impact? And so it's not that there's different models, or models that are incorrect or correct. It's just that the model must be useful to the question you're trying to answer. Mm. And so we ultimately, we talk about the AIDS model, but actually we probably had 8 or 10 versions of it. We had one that operated at a provincial level. We had a sub-Saharan African model. We had one that looked at demographics, orphans, dependency ratios, and things like that. We had one that looked at impact on medical schemes. And then importantly, and this is an important one for COVID-19, we had some models that looked at interventions. What if there's education benefits? What if there's public health care benefits? What if there's treatment benefits? So today with COVID-19, what is the impact of lockdown? Or what is the impact of using masks? All of those things will be modeled. The challenge for people modeling today is we probably had a bit more time. So as I described to you, the AIDS and HIV epidemic unfolded over several years.
Yes.
And so we probably had a bit more time to collect data. We still didn't have a lot of data, but we had a little bit more time. For people doing modeling today, the pressure is immense. We've known about this virus for 6 months, but the first models were produced within 2 months of the virus being first found, when they had no data at all. And so one of the things about a model is how you calibrate it against known data. So the early models had no data really. They just had a starting point.
Yeah.
Everything after that was an assumption. At least we've got about 6 months of data now, so we're more able to calibrate the models.
Okay. It's a very interesting paradigm shift to think about, for me at least, the usefulness of the model versus the accuracy or inaccuracy of it.
Yes.
If you can answer that question, and if it is useful, then you can apply it respectively.
Yes.
Which is quite a good insight. So you elegantly termed the other day the second pandemic as being the rise of misinformation in a discussion that we had. And I'm just interested to hear from you. And I think the general man on the street that maybe doesn't understand all the nuances of data analytics and the obtaining of data from relevant sources. What type of filters, and you did implicitly allude to them in your previous answer, but what filters, 1, 2, or 3 filters, can the man on the street apply when looking at COVID-19 related data, when they want to try and make sense on a micro and macro level of this pandemic that they find themselves in? And are there a few good sources of information, modeling, graphs, etc., where we could go to keep an eye on what's happening as this unfolds?
Yes, that's a good question. As I said earlier, there's a lot of data available. There's probably too much data. And in fact, I read the other day that they said the number of new graphs of the COVID-19 epidemic has peaked, meaning every day there was a new graph or a new database or a new set of data available. So my experience has been, if you look at, well, let's just talk about South Africa and let's talk about the world. There is really good data available. If you look at the World Health Organization, but if you also look at a well-known website called Our World in Data. Our World in Data is an open forum website that has just a huge collection of open source data. And I like using that website because I mentioned earlier about data bias. I mean, they spend an immense amount of effort making sure that they can validate the data, that they can attribute the source of the data. And they don't have a particular agenda other than making data publicly available. So there are quite a few of those that are now available. There's 3 or 4, in fact there's more, there's probably about 10 or 12 COVID-19 dashboards in South Africa, including from the Department of Health, at the University of Pretoria and the University of the Witwatersrand, and quite a number of other organizations have published so-called dashboards. So the one usefulness of all those dashboards at the moment is if you compare them, you can see they're very similar. So there doesn't seem to be any inherent bias in the data, depending on the source. Having said that, of course, that is based on the data that is being published. So perhaps just drop down one level below that. We don't yet know how many people are COVID-19 infected in South Africa. We know how many tests we've done, and we know from the tests how many people have been tested positive. But we haven't tested the whole population. We've only tested a fraction of the population, probably in the order of 1/50th of the population have been tested in South Africa. And by the way, that's not a bad outcome. Probably the highest in the world is a place like Iceland that's tested about 10% or 15% of their population. But then Ireland with 300,000 people, we're a dispersed country with 57 million people. So we know that not everybody's been tested, but it tells you what it tells you. It tells you of the people that have been tested, that this is how many people are positive. And perhaps I should just talk about that a little bit, is to say, oftentimes we don't have data, not because people aren't prepared to publish it, it's just because it doesn't exist. So I think there's a natural tendency for people to be suspicious of data sources, and particularly from the government and that. But the one useful thing in South Africa that we've seen is that there's so many different sources of data that are agreeing that, I think there's a good case to be made that the data that we're seeing is the data that we're getting. So that's the data that's available. So from that, you can draw some conclusions. But if you start looking at the data by saying, I'm sure this is underreported, I'm sure this is biased, I'm sure the politicians are holding stuff back from me, well then there's a point at which you're just shooting yourself in the foot. The only really good data that's available, you're discarding even before you look at it. So I'd rather say, okay, that's where it's coming from, that's what it's based on. The one thing that has been a bit difficult for people to process is that it's quite important to understand why the tests are being done. Are tests being done just on a screening basis? Are they being done just for people in hospital? Are they being done for contact tracing purposes? So sometimes that affects the outcome. And that's what I mentioned to you before about bias.
Yes.
That does affect the number that you're seeing, but it doesn't make it right or wrong. It just makes it, well, that's the number. So I just want to talk about the numbers very briefly because I think it is helpful that one has a sensible approach to the data.
For sure.
Because otherwise you have no basis to really understand or process what's going on. So I mean, at the moment, for example, we know there's about 80,000 people that have tested positive in South Africa for COVID-19, and we know about 60,000 of those are in Cape Town or in the Western Cape, in the Western Province. But if you look at what we also need to look at is the number of recoveries. And I think this is worth thinking about because of COVID-19, how it actually works out through a population is that it's a very short time from infection to symptoms. It's a very short time from symptoms to critical illness or death or recovery. So it does have one advantage that, okay, we don't yet know quite enough about immunity after recovery, but let's just leave that aside for the moment. But what we do know, although there's 80,000 people roughly in South Africa, that's just today, it'll change by tomorrow, people infected with the virus, we know that there's about 42,000 people that have recovered. And that's important to think about that because it doesn't mean to say that there's 80,000 people sick at the moment, and there's 80,000 people that have tested positive. There's only a few thousand in hospitals, and there's only been about 1,500 deaths in South Africa. So you need to put those into context in terms of order of magnitude, but also to look at the number of people that have recovered. And the big advantage about recoveries is those people, as far as we know, are no longer infectious. So they're no longer able to infect other people. So I think it's important to have some sort of sense of the order of magnitude of numbers. And so that's the one thing that I would say is although of course it's changing very rapidly, it changes week by week. For example, I mentioned to you the Western Province had 60,000 infections, but 3 weeks ago it was 15,000.
Sure.
But today, both the Eastern Cape and Gauteng have about 15,000 infections, 12 to 15,000. So that means, that there's probably only a factor of time between the Western Province and Gauteng, for example, just that it happens to be 2 or 3 weeks in advance. And so I think it's important just to say, look, try and get reasonable sources of data, try and look at the orders of magnitude of the data, and try and filter out what I'd call the noise. And the noise is often, it might come from the media, it might come from the political space and domain. And I think, we've seen that unfortunately in the countries, I think, that have struggled to deal with this virus, or the ones where the politics have struggled. This is a disaster that I think is a national disaster. And I think, there are moments in time where I think, you need to try as leaders, I think people who are in leadership positions need to try and say, okay, what is in the best national interest? Is this a time to be political or score political points, or is this a time to take leadership and make a real difference for your population? And so one of the problems with data is that it can be used as a weapon, or it can be weaponized, if you want to call it that. And I think that's where one should be a bit more careful. Just look at the source of the data, see how it's being used, who's talking about it, in what way are they using it, and just be a bit more objective about how you then respond to it. Because if you don't, then you're in a continuous state of panic and uncertainty, and uncertainty is never good.
No, it isn't. Thanks, Peter. That's super helpful. And I'm definitely going to go visit a few of those dashboards and apply those filters as I look at the data, which will definitely help serve to lower the anxiety level and help me to look at it rationally, which I think is important at a time such as this. From a mortality impact in South Africa, I've seen numbers ranging from models estimating 10,000 odd deaths, and I've seen models going up to about 50,000 deaths, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the general trend in South Africa is that about 450,000 people die each year in the country due to many factors. So just interested to speak into the latest mortality impacts and modeling that we've seen around that and how that compares to other sources or factors of death in South Africa.
Yeah. So just before I get there, just to mention, you've said there is this range of numbers, and I have seen those sorts of numbers as well, estimates of mortality between 10 and 40 to 50,000 people in South Africa in the next 12 months. Just time box it as well.
Yes, thanks.
The biggest debate, this is a global debate and a South African debate, is that the mortality numbers are looking a bit lower than some of these forecasts. But the big debate globally is this because of what they call non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, or things like the lockdown and the wearing of masks and hygiene factors and education and so on.
Okay.
Is the lower levels of mortality due to those actions, or are they due to just a natural evolution of the virus as it moves through a population based on susceptibility and comorbidity? And that would have happened anyway. So that's a massive worldwide debate at the moment, and you can understand that it's a kind of a polarizing debate. You almost find nobody in the middle of that debate. There's either for or against.
Can imagine.
And primarily because of the economic impact of the lockdown. If I can just mention a very brief aside, I mean, the one country that I look at a lot is Sweden, and only because Sweden was the primary country in Europe that didn't take a lockdown route.
Yes.
And in the very early part of the epidemic, first 2-3 months, Sweden looked to have made the correct decision, and many people used that as the best example of the fact that you shouldn't lock down. However, the sort of numbers we're seeing now, Sweden is tracking to be one of the countries with the highest level of mortality per million of population. Just to give you an order of magnitude, about 10 times that of Norway, which is its nearest, almost comparable neighbor. So that's just one illustration of the fact that perhaps the NPIs or the lockdowns have had a significant impact on the epidemic. But then simultaneously, the economic outcome in Sweden is not very different from its near neighbors and the rest of Europe. And the reason for that largely is that this economic impact has been a global impact, and it almost overcomes the extent to which you had a local lockdown. Just the global movement of tourists and import and export, etc., has a greater impact on what you did locally. So that's just the one point.
Very interesting.
The other point, as you mentioned, just again, orders of magnitude help. Yes, so there are estimates that that COVID-19 could have the impact of up to 40,000 deaths in South Africa, and of course that is really unfortunate. But it is in the context of a country where we have 450,000 deaths a year in South Africa from all causes and diseases. And what one needs to think about as well is that during the lockdown, there was a dramatic decrease in mortality in South Africa, as you know, because of significantly lower motor vehicle accident deaths, violence deaths, alcohol-related, etc. So actually the lockdown had a really, really beneficial impact on mortality in whole South Africa just by reducing those forms of death. I mean, just to give you an indication, annually about 40,000 people in South Africa die from accidents and violence. About 30,000 die from TB and about 25,000 die from HIV and AIDS. So COVID-19 is a disease that's probably at the same level as diabetes, HIV and TB. And so it is that level of order of magnitude. So it is a significant new disease in the population.
Yes.
It is at a significant level. but it won't change the population dynamics. It might increase mortality by 10% overall in a year, which in itself is not significant. But what is significant, of course, is the impact that it has, and that's the big unknown at the moment, is the impact that it has on the healthcare system. So the healthcare system is in a position where in South Africa, we have existing challenges on the healthcare system. And I think that's been seen around the world as the biggest impact has been on existing healthcare systems, existing ICU capacity and things like that,
yes,
which itself has a bit of a knock-on effect. And we're not yet sure how that's going to work out in South Africa.
Thanks, Peter. That serves to paint the picture much more clearly. And as you say, the orders of magnitude in putting COVID into relation with some of the other mortality factors in South Africa is very informative. Maybe as a last question, you did refer to the big lockdown, no lockdown debate and the various NPI debates that are reigning out there. And as you say, they are quite polarizing and you rarely find someone in the middle of the spectrum. So I'm just interested to hear from your perspective, based on the latest data that you've seen, a continued lockdown in South Africa in whatever form or manner, whether it's level 3A or 3.95 or level 2, does that still serve a purpose? Or based on what you've seen data-wise, should we rather just get back to fully fledged economic activity and people moving about as they would have before the pandemic? I know you mentioned also with the great influenza, mobility and movement in these cases, and again in this case, is a big factor. So just interested to hear from you, as a last parting shot, what you think the benefits of a continued state of lockdown would be in South Africa.
You do want to ask the difficult questions. So, well, again, just looking back at the data, I mean, the country that's emerging, to my mind, is probably the worst affected in the world at the moment is Brazil. And in fact, in general, South America. If you look at South America, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Ecuador are starting to be the countries that are going to be the worst affected in the world. If you look at Brazil in particular, if you followed Brazil, there's been a massive political battle in Brazil. It's also a country that has states. So there's state leaders and there's a national leader. There's a big divide between the states and the cities, particularly between Rio and Sao Paulo. And I think there's very clear emerging evidence in Brazil. It's a big enough country that you can do that you can see at the state or province or national level the outcomes depending on the extent to which there was a lockdown or not. And there was part of the country that had no lockdown. They're seeing very poor health outcomes.
Okay.
So I have no doubt that the lockdown, and there's a number of countries now where there's a long enough time period to examine these and look at their different changes in lockdowns to say that the lockdown definitely has an impact. The debate, of course, is actually on, is the spread of the epidemic inevitable and the lockdown only postpones it? Yes. So if you only achieve this one thing of postponing it, is it worth it? So I would say two things. I mean, the one is that, and I did mention this earlier, compared to 4 or 5 months ago, there's a dramatic improvement on the ability to manage the healthcare outcomes of COVID-19 patients. So even if you're just in the lockdown, you've pushed 5 months into the future, the peak of sickness or the epidemic, you can have better health outcomes because there's more knowledge. The second thing is, if you look at the way the models work out and you look at some of the data of the countries that have locked down and not only do you push the peak forward, you flatten the peak. And I know flattening the curve has been talked about ad nauseum, but it really does have this effect of spreading it out over time. So instead of having a peak, say, over 3 weeks, you might have a peak over 3 months.
Okay.
And that has a significant difference on your healthcare system and the ability to deal with patients. So, I mean, to my mind, there's no question that at a broad level, interventions have been helpful and will be helpful. At a micro level, one can debate endlessly, is this regulation or that regulation sensible or not sensible? And I think, unfortunately, immediately you start talking about that, you end up in the political domain of saying, well, are there other factors at play? Why are these decisions being made? Are these health-informed decisions or are they political-informed decisions? And then it becomes what I'd call noise. It becomes very noisy at that level. But broadly speaking, there's no question that, in fact, let me just turn it around. If one had a situation in South Africa where our president didn't intervene and didn't go on national television and have a lockdown, I think we would have had a disastrous outcome, and he would have correctly received a lot of flack for doing that. So now some actions have been taken, and the flack's in another direction. Now you've had effect on economics and jobs and things like that, which is a real impact.
Yes.
But it's a really difficult choice.
Mm.
I have just seen a model recently by Zinn and Myers. It's a well-known model about dealing with the emotional response to a crisis. And I'll send it to you. It's a really, you might want to send it out to the listeners of the podcast.
Thanks
but
so
it
much.
does talk about people's emotional responses to an epidemic, and it talks about, having a threat, having an impact. Then you have the heroes who emerge to deal with the impact. Then you have a honeymoon period where everybody's collaborating and cohesive. And then you have a dramatic decline into disillusionment. So it comes back to this analogy of, how long is this race, And when you're halfway through the race, it seems like, you've put all this effort in and you're nowhere near the end. And I think that's pretty much where we're at the moment. And therefore, I think we've become critical of everything. And so, look, has it all been worth it? Are our leaders even being sensible? Are they making the right decisions? Am I going to come out of this alive, etc.? People become very disillusioned. And I think that's where we're at the moment. And I think it's really important to say, look, this is very natural. It's a natural cycle. But what we do need to look at is at some point, and I don't think it's very far in the future, you need to start looking at reconstruction. Okay, how do we reconstruct this? We've had the crisis, we've faced the crisis, we've survived the crisis, we've managed to put in interventions, but now there's some reconstruction that's needed. Yes. You have to work through what is the implication on jobs and businesses and things like that. And the thing about the reconstruction phase, it's normally quite a positive phase because you actually feel like you have some influence and control again. At the moment, people are feeling not in control. And as I said earlier, that's never a good place to be.
No, that's very true. I think there is definitely a sense of fatigue setting in. And as you've mentioned to and alluded to, so I'd be interested to also see that graph and we'll attach it so the listeners can look at it. But there's been a whole range of human emotions that's been experienced since we first encountered this disease and since we first went into lockdown on the 26th or 7th of March. But it is good to be reminded, for me personally, of the benefits of the lockdown that we've had in South Africa and the pushing out of the peak of the curve and the flattening of the curve. Those are considerable advantages of a lockdown state and all the other NPI methods and methodologies that have been applied. So it is good to hear and just be reminded of that again, because as you say, one tends to become quite negative at some stage and many people are there now where we become overly critical of the measures that have been taken with the benefit of hindsight behind us and already the benefit of a pushed out curve and a flattened curve probably as a result of lockdown. So very valuable insights to take into consideration when we look at the reigning conditions. So thank you, Peter, for your time. It was super insightful. I learned a lot. Appreciate it.
Johan, thank you very much. It was really nice to talk to you as well.
Thanks, Peter.